So welcome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for J Taran Diamond's residency presentation. If you haven't muted yourself, please do for the presentation. I'm Jen Moore. I'm one of the BJC's studio managers and exhibition directors. For anyone who hasn't attended one of our talks before, just a little breakdown of the evening's program. I'll provide a very brief introduction. We'll hear from Jay directly, and following Jay's presentation, we will view the residency exhibition in our hall gallery, and then we'll have some time for Q&A before we close out. I would be remiss if I did not mention that we are currently in the midst of our summer fundraising season, and we're trying to raise $50,000 by September 30th. And our board has graciously agreed to help us meet that goal with a dollar-for-dollar match up to $25,000, which is very exciting. The funds raised help support all of our programs like the artist residency, scholarships, and work study positions, as well as youth workforce development and community programs that we all love so much and couldn't do without this help with funding. So if you are able to, please donate. No donation is too large or too small. We appreciate everything, and it helps us bring this kind of programming to you. So Jay's introduction, J Taran Diamond is a metalsmith and interdisciplinary craft artist based in Athens, Georgia. They study and teach at the University of Georgia and hold a BFA from the University of North Texas. Diamond's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including exhibitions at New York City Jewelry Week, Munich Jewelry Week, and the Czong Institute of Contemporary Art in Gimpo, South Korea. Outside of the studio, Diamond is an advocate for Black people in academia and works to dismantle the systemic barriers that make higher education inaccessible to Black people. And now I will turn it over to the person we've been waiting to hear from.
Thank you so much to Jen for that incredible introduction. In fact, I'd like to start by thanking everybody here at the BJC for being as incredible as they are and creating a space in which I was able to make the work that I've been making this past month. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into a presentation. By this point, y'all probably all already know that I'm J Taran Diamond. So this is a piece from my BFA thesis. At the time, I was making very massive, heavy floral pieces that investigated jewelry's role as a signifier of class and relationship to labor. I don't want to dwell too much on this work because it is fairly old, but I think it's useful context for my later interest in the social function of jewelry and objects. I also think it's very important to note that at the time I was making this work, it was very reliant on significant resources to produce and significant space to store, which prompted a very necessary shift in my studio practice towards something more sustainable when the pandemic began and we were all sort of trapped in our homes. Which leads me to the work that I was doing in my first year of graduate school. I was interested in streamlining the processes that I was using and the materials that I was using, and I eventually began working primarily with silicone and titanium, partially because they both have a long history of being used as substitutes or additions to the human body, but also more practically because they were easier to store than steel or paper and far, far cheaper than silver. When I began working with these materials, the world at large was beginning to experience a very intense period of touch starvation and intense loneliness. And I felt that I was and at the time, that was very similar to feelings that I had experienced for a very long time as a neurodivergent person. And I became interested in creating surrogates for these experiences and creating devices that could function to provide interpersonal contact when it wasn't possible. I also became very interested in the idea of the labor of love and the premise that the labor used to create work is stored within that work as a form of affection that is usable and appreciable by the object's recipient or user. To that end, I began very intensely stitching together these devices. And in a way, I was referencing quilting by quilting. Eventually, as always happens when working in art, I hit a wall, partially because I felt that the work had been overcomplicated and I wasn't quite sure what it should be moving forward, and partially because of some other factors that I'll talk more about later. But because of that wall, I took a break from this work from the late 2020 and early 2021 until about April of 2022. In April of 2022, I was invited to participate in an exhibition called Tender Presence, which centered queer narratives in jewelry and craft. And this was the first time I had actively centered queerness as a theme in something that I considered serious work. I streamlined the work once again, as I had immediately following the pandemic, and began focusing primarily on interpersonal contact and intimacy through the matched pair and the gesture of wearing jewelry. I consider this work foundational for the work that I made while I've been here in Baltimore. I mentioned earlier that I took a break from the work that I was making with silicone and titanium. And while a lot of that was to aid in the development of that work, a substantially larger portion was due to the experience that I was having in Georgia. I had moved to Georgia for graduate school, and though I've lived in the South for quite some time, it was my first time in the deep South, and it was my first time living in a city with buildings built by slaves and attending a university with buildings built by slaves. That experience began to weigh down on me until I felt that it was necessary to address the presence of racial violence in the material and social culture of the South. Often this resulted in focuses on specific historic sites, events, and objects, such as Lake Lanier, which is referenced in this piece, Something in the Water 1. For those of you who are not aware, I assume most of you, Lake Lanier is the largest freshwater reservoir in the state of Georgia. It serves the Atlanta metro, as well as other parts of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. At the bottom of Lake Lanier is a former Black township called Oscarville. And though the decision to create Lake Lanier by damming the Chattahoochee River was initially motivated by the need for a reservoir of fresh water, the decision to dam it just downstream of Oscarville was primarily intended to drive out Black residents of Oscarville from the primarily white city of crime. I became focused on the presence of violence as a material and reckoning with the history of the South and the way the South remembers its own history. And I also became interested in reflecting the dichotomy of experience that Black and white people have in the South through the doubling of objects. This doubling is first visible in this piece titled A Whole World, which wants only to be graceful and beautiful, in which the material cotton that I use is doubled by the image of cotton that's pierced into the mother of pearl, And similarly, the viewer or user of the object is doubled by their reflection in the stainless steel surface of the fan. In the 1903 text, The Souls of Black Folk, W.B.E. Du Bois describes a double consciousness, a sort of psychological violence Black people are subject to when experiencing themselves both through their own perspectives and through white supremacist perspectives. I've come to feel that this double consciousness also extends to objects. And through this double consciousness, objects become able to code switch in a way similar to people, and then become active participants in anti-Black psychological violence. In this work, Badge of Honor, architectural details from the historically maintained home of James Camac, a Confederate architect, railway engineer, and slave owner, are made into a badge and a branding iron, but it is posited that the objects are not separate, but one and the same. As one might imagine, constantly thinking about the intense racial violence of the South is not particularly good for one's mental health. Similarly, constantly traveling to historical sites across the South is not particularly financially sustainable. So I have been thinking for a long time about ways that I can work in the studio and ways that I can engage with narratives around Blackness that preserve my psychological well-being and engage with the many things that I find compelling about jewelry and objects as mediums. This piece, entitled Good Hair, started as an investigation of the ways that Black bodies and their features are perceived. But shortly after finishing it, I came to interpret it as a reflection on my relationship with my own hair as a queer Black person. That brings me to the work that I've made since I've been here in Baltimore. When I arrived here, I was very interested in my queerness as it exists through the lens of Blackness, in particular, through the lens of Black hair. The first time that I had my hair braided, or the first time that I got box braids rather, was done by my sister-in-law in her home. And I think that was the very first time that I ever experienced gender euphoria. And I consider, or I credit those braids with fundamentally changing the way that I understand my identity as a queer Black person. I'm also very interested in the social context of Black hair and braids, in particular, their power as a mode of body transformation that exists solely within the context of Blackness, and as a symbol and function of community, as many Black people braid the hair of their loved ones or have their hair braided by their loved ones. I continued investigating that relationship between Blackness and queerness in this piece entitled Big Black. I was interested in the tendency to assign hypermasculinity to Black people, especially Black people assigned male at birth. And I was interested in subverting that by creating an undeniably phallic object that is at the same time intensely effeminate. In this body of work, and especially in this piece, I believe that camp and humor become present in my work again for the first time since my BFA thesis. In this work, I also continue to engage in ideas around intimacy, less by creating relationships or narratives between two wearers, but by creating facets of pieces that are only accessible to the wearer. Each of the pieces that I made while I've been here in Baltimore has specific details on the back that are entirely invisible from the front and can only be experienced by the wearer. As I continued to make work here, I also became more and more interested in finding a place for humor in my work, which I think reaches a climax in this work, Nautilus Costs Extra. For those who have never had their hair braided before, professional hair braiders, especially younger professional hair braiders, are notorious for adding on unnecessary and unreasonable extra fees and charges to their services. And in this work, I was interested in directly poking fun at those extra fees and charges. The vast majority of the body that of work that I've developed while I've been here, though, has been in a series that I've called Slippage. In each of these brooches, I take a single braid, representative of a slipped braid that one might find lying on the ground outside, and I recontextualize it in a jewelry object. In doing this, I attend to address the space between body and accessory that hair, and especially braids, often occupy, and how that relates to queer identity, and how the role of hair as body or accessory changes at different times. In these pieces, queerness reemerges through the implication of a previous wearer, of whose appearance and persona the braid was a deliberately constructed component. Upon finding the braid, one is invited to wonder who once wore the braid, what sort of appearance they might have crafted for themselves, and if they're aware that it's gone. And that is all that I have for y'all tonight. Thank you all so much for coming. I am so happy to have been able to make work here in Baltimore at the Baltimore Jewelry Center with the incredible community that they fostered here.
Thank you, Jay. So we're just gonna switch the camera and just give us just one moment. And we will, okay. We're gonna move into the hallway. Let's take a look in the chat. People are saying thank you. Super interesting, great work. Shane is saying the back plates of your recent work are anodized. Demi says, ooh. Shane, does anyone else have questions that they want to put in the chat? I know that Jay spent a lot of time making these up color matches for the elements of the pieces, which is really great to observe. Do you have anything else you want to add, Jay?
Nothing that I can think of, but I'm sure I'll have plenty to say.
Do we have questions from anyone here? Okay.
So the pieces that are made of singular braids, after hearing your narrative behind them, I was wondering if there's any like violence in the implication of them being like single.
More often than not, when braids slip, it's a matter of insufficient tension between the hair that's added for the braid and the hair that goes from the scalp. But that's not always the case, and I think I'm very interested in the ambiguity about that experience, especially as so many queer people, especially queer femmes, are often subject to violence.
Thank you. Would you describe what neurodivergence means to you?
So for me personally, I am autistic and I have difficulties with intimacy and like skin to skin contact. But I think that it would be irresponsible of me to say that that is necessarily everyone's experience with neurodivergence.
I'm curious about like the role of like looseness and then form in your work. I'm seeing a lot of like structure and then also like letting the material kind of like act as itself, especially with the hair. I was curious about that dichotomy.
I haven't necessarily thought a lot about the dichotomy between structure and looseness, but I have thought a lot about the formal function of the braid as a single line. And I think when I was considering the way that I was constructing my brooches, I was interested in sort of like finding a next step to the relationship between the work and gesture that I had in the pieces that I made for tender presents.
It's not pictured here, but can I ask why you used mother of pearl in the fan? I thought it was very powerful.
So the fan that I showed in that talk was, from a technical perspective, a reproduction of an antebellum folding fan. In that body of work, I'm very interested in like historical objects that exist and historical places and people that exist.
So it's realism you're going for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know. I know people were having a hard time hearing on the, I don't know if it's gotten a little better. I'm trying to get very close to Jay. Sorry. That it would hopefully make the sound a little bit better. But yeah, if you, does anyone in the chat have any questions? Shane said the formal function of the braid and the single line. I love that. Yeah, it's really powerful. Okay, be loud.
Okay, I'll be very loud. What is the significance of these shapes that you used in the single braids?
The shapes don't have any immediate significance. I was interested in recreating the way that braids appear to have just fallen on the ground when one finds a slipped braid.
I'm especially curious about these two pieces, the belt loop and the bracelet, or the belt buckle and the bracelet, and like how you would envision them being worn in the world.
I don't know how I would envision them being worn like out in the wild. When I think about wearing the bracelet, I think that I would like to see it be worn by a dancer or for dancing. When I think about the like how I envision the belt buckle existing in the wild, I just imagine like some like very campy, intensely flamboyant man wearing like assless chaps.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Mary Ravel is asking, is there any significance to the colors you chose?
It was important to me that the majority of the work be very brightly colored, partially because things that are visually loud are often more tied to queerness, which is something you can see in like dialogue surrounding camp. But the initial consideration for color that everything was sort of descended from was that most of my previous work with silicone and with titanium was all in a white and gray palette. And I felt that it wouldn't be fitting to make work about blackness that is all white.
Yeah. So Demi is asking in the chat, I'm interested in the braid as a remnant of identity, which is then recontextualized in the format of jewelry. Who is the wearer?
I think for a lot of these, I am the wearer, which is maybe a less than ideal answer for jewelry that I hope to sell at some point. But I'm interested in, I imagine, or I am interested in these being worn by people who have to deliberately construct their identities and their appearances in ways similar to queer femmes, especially queer Black femmes.
Victoria Pass is asking, I wonder if you think about this jewelry in relation to the history of hair jewelry. I'm thinking about the ideas of friendship, romance, memory, and mourning that are often part of hair jewelry in the 19th century.
I haven't necessarily thought about the relationship between hair jewelry and romance, but I definitely, when I was like first considering this work and figuring out what I wanted to make, especially for the slippage brooches, thinking about its function in relation to memory, because in a lot of ways I am asking the person who wears this brooch to remember someone that they've never met.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering if the element of humor in your work is more for you or if it's more for the viewer.
I think that it is both. I think that the objects that I'm making in the body work that I have going on back in Georgia are so devoid of humor and devoid of camp and devoid of any kind of joy. But with these objects, I want to make jewelry that makes me happy, and I want to make jewelry that makes other people happy, because jewelry makes me happy.
Yeah.
Not a particularly eloquent answer, I think, but
They are very fresh and they have this sense of being alive. And I think you've really captured that in the forms that you have, the colors that you've chosen, and the material. I think these are very successful objects.
thank you.
I think the make yourself laugh first principle goes a long way. Well, I'm someone who has experienced joke writing. You start with yourself. If you can make yourself laugh, you can probably make yourself laugh. And I found it fun.
Victoria Pass is saying in comment like to what you said about remembering and hair. She says, I love the idea of remembering someone you've never met. That feels like asking for empathy, which is such an interesting thing to do with somebody, with something you wear on the body. Mary Ravel asks, also, is there any reason you chose to use the brooch format specifically?
I think personally, brooches are my favorite type of jewelry. I think it's very romantic that someone can find an object so endearing or so captivating that despite existing separately as its own concrete object off the body, they feel an urge to affix it to their own body or incorporate it to their own body. And I think that in a lot of ways that is adjacent to what is done with braiding often, as this is hair that ostensibly does not belong to us and is not part of our body, but we then take it and affix it to our body so that it becomes part of the body. That answer may or may not have been anything, but I hope it answered the question.
I like the too. I have had an at a shop, and you're asking a stranger to have empathy for you if you're tender-headed, and it's painful for them to braid, and it's also painful for the recipient of the braid. So that labor of love, I think, the hair itself had to be able to take it just as much as you had to be able to stand putting the work in. I think that's interesting.
So I think it was hard to hear that comment for the people online, because you have a very soft voice. Do you want to repeat it louder, or do you want me to that it was that I don't know if I can do this justice, that there is a reciprocal relationship when you get your hair braided. It is a very intimate relationship. I mean, and I remember having that as a child. Definitely the intimacy of having someone braid your hair, and it is both can be a painful action for them and also a painful action for you if you're tender-headed, or that it is labor, and that it requires empathy on both sides.
And especially at a shop where they're turning people out and you got to get all braided up and somebody else is sewing the hair in. It's just, their fingers hurt, your head hurts, and everybody's miserable, but the music's bumping and everybody's getting along somehow. And it's very beautiful how the pain is healing somehow.
Shared suffering.
Yeah, the suffering, the shared suffering. It's builds solidarity in a community. And I think we've lost that tribal element. yeah, the community aspect of hair braiding. Thank you for bringing that up too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I can never tell if I'm supposed to look at the camera or not.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Going forward from the experiences here in Baltimore, and just in your life in this residency, what do you think you'll take forward into your next projects?
I'm interested in maintaining this work as like a continued body separate from what I'm doing back in Georgia. I will probably make this work in Georgia as well, but like separate from that work. And I am interested in like finding further ways to explore the intersection of queer and Black bodies through objects and jewelry, because we engage with objects so much in our day-to-day lives. And I think that there are so very few narratives about Blackness, especially in contemporary art, that are centered primarily around joy and like the idea that a body is something that you can love and feel euphoric about within the context of Blackness, that I want to continue making work within that perspective.
Did the city of Baltimore itself in any way inspire the avenue to a more joyous body of work?
I think in a way, I found the pink hair in a beauty supply store in Athens, but all of the other hair that I have used in this body of work has been sourced from beauty supply stores around Baltimore. And it was important to me to be able to see those spaces, both because I love beauty supply stores as spaces, but also because Baltimore as a city has such a high Black population. I wanted to make work that was connected to the city.
Cool.
Are there any other questions that anyone has in the chat?
I just wanted to say I'm having to tune in from home.
Do you remember the thought process that led you to, yes, this is what I'm going to do for this here now?
I think the thing that originally sparked it so though I used to get my hair braided by my sister, I have since started braiding my own hair. And at some point while I was here, or while I was back in Athens, I was braiding my own hair and I said, hold on a second, I have to do this. Like this is, like for a lot of reasons, continuing the body of work that I was doing back in Athens wasn't a viable plan for my residency. And I feel like it was just sort of a light bulb moment.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing.
Okay, thank you, Jay. And thank you everyone for coming. If you enjoyed this talk we have, please join us for a presentation with Andy Lowry, who is our teaching fellow, our inaugural teaching fellow, will be giving a talk about his work and the show Fulfillment, which is currently in our gallery on August 25th. And you can sign up for that in our, let me see. I will drop a link in the chat a little when I'm done with this. And please remember, if you can, please donate. That we rely on your donations to give you programming like this and bring wonderful artists like Jay to the BJC. So thank you so much for coming, and please join us for Andy's talk and hopefully a trunk show that will be launched on the 25th and will last for a few days after the 25th if you are here in person. All right, thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully we will see you on the 25th.